Chapter 7. The conversation with Ian had been enlightening. More than a few centuries back, Ian had noticed that members of the O'Keefe line were apparently very popular targets for the Sidhe. To save his people, he made a bargain with one of the Seelie, the Griffin King. In exchange for a century of service, all O'Keefes everywhere, born or adopted, were protected from being taken against their will. They could still bargain, agree, or be tricked into crossing over, but never by physical force. When he returned, he found his people still in need, just from more mundane sources. He came to the New World, unwilling or unable to compete with the current mortal chieftain, and began unifying the family there, helping other poor Irish as he was able. He quickly foresaw New York as a bad place to stop. It would soon be overcrowded with immigrants coming in with no money to keep moving on. So he moved the bulk of his people south, to the Florida Territory, carved himself out a nice little stretch of land where he found what amounted to a fairy fort, a rath. There was a clear trod there, and one of the reasons the natives avoided the area. He built his house, put up homes for the people he brought, found ways to manage the rath, and built himself a fortress on the old model. This meant the main house was the center of the land, with everything else radiating out from it, and a wall surrounding the property. It was not at all what an Englishman or American thinks of when they hear the word fortress. It wasn't extremely defensible, but didn't really need to be. When the Civil War broke out and stretched far enough, they were more than capable of defending the land. When the wild hunt came through, they found ways of confining it and protecting the people from its predations. A rath on the property meant the occasional taken found their way out. It also provided an avenue of approach for those who would offer their service to the Dadannan. This meant an unusual concentration of the touched living in the region, and from time to time the taken from other places found their way here. He found places for them all as if they were Irish or family if they desired it, and all he asked was allegiance, so that everyone's needs could be met. While the nearby city began growing, he insinuated himself into the general doings of it. He got involved in the politics for a while, but never more than he really had to in order to see that his people got what they needed. He frequently paid to bring scores of Irish immigrants south to the rest, got them citizenship, jobs, and homes, and settled in a place where they could breathe and be Irish. He even set up a primary school that taught Irish in addition to the regular classes, and made certain that every child, and some of the adults who lived there, could read and do their sums. He paid heavily into the nearby government to make certain that the laws never became hostile to anyone because of their original nationality, and that his community was left alone. Heavy enchantments on the wall helped with that. When Prohibition came along, he naturally ended up on the wrong side of things. Thus began his career as a crime boss, especially when other families tried to take over. Ian was Irish Mafia, not the kind seen in films or read about in stories, though An was unfamiliar with what he'd meant by that. He provided for the family however necessary, but not always legally. He ran some drugs, but nothing hardcore or dangerous, and, in fact, deliberately kept out the hard stuff. He ran gambling halls and other vice clubs, or rather, ran the people who did. He used toughs to enforce his will and his people's needs. In short, he was still a chieftain of old. He just occasionally broke a few laws to do it. In order to keep out real gangs and mobs, he had to become one himself. The Russian mob was a nasty bit of business. No heart, no compassion, no higher purpose, just unbridled capitalism backed by violence and underhanded tactics. They had moved in over the last 20 years, and Ian was hard-pressed to keep them under control. This is what Ian had been doing when An had her revelation, for which he thanked her. He said he might call upon that talent at a later date, but that he would try to keep her out of the business as much as possible. It was mid-July, and the weather was suffocating for An. The new clothing was helping as much as anything could, but she could tell that the people around her were sweating, even in their short pants and revealing tops. She was learning quickly, figuring out modern life as well as learning to deal with her handicap. Having finally gotten the hang of Braille, she began reading history books by the dozen in an attempt to catch up. In a joint effort to learn and help Bethany and Celaine with their homework, she had them read to her from whatever textbooks they were studying at the time. Liberty and Roulette had taken her under wing and were fond of dragging her out on excursions. Ian had managed her illegal ID and the requisite papers, so she was able to get a library card. The library quickly became her favorite place to go, much to the frustration of the ladies. The mall just made her feel lost, but she would never say anything. The two women were getting almost possessive of her, highly protective. Once, on an outing, someone had commented on Ann's attire, and before she could fashion a reply, Roulette had countered with, "It's a religious thing." She was eternally grateful for the two women, but she was getting restless, feeling useless and without purpose, and depression was setting in. Ann's favorite room in the house was the front sitting room, what she thought of as the magnolia room for the heavenly citrus fragrance from the large waxy blossoms Martha filled it with. The room had 4 large windows on 2 sides and an open doorway to catch both errant breezes from the other parts of the house and the people who wandered in and out at all hours. She had long ago learned the house was an open one. No one ever knocked unless they did not belong, and often as not, the door was propped open. She had asked Ian the safety of that, with the situation with the Russians, but his response was simple. Anyone coming to the house had to pass through the majority of the rather active rest. If they were new or did not belong, the house knew long before they arrived. This particular July morning, Ann was in the sitting room, in her favorite wing-back chair in the corner, trying her best to crochet while she listened to the conversation going on around her. Some of the men, Reggie and Henry and a few others, were in the living room very loudly watching a basketball game. Ann thought she heard a feminine voice in there as well, but she couldn't be sure. She and Bethany were helping Kelaine with her Irish, while Gabby sat nearby, knitting needles clicking madly away. Others came, stayed for a bit, and went, but the 4 of them remained constant. "They're getting loud," Bethany grumbled in Irish from the floor, where the girls had sprawled and spread out their books and papers. "I don't really get that sport at all. Chasing a ball around a court and not allowed to touch other players." Gabby chuckled over her needles. "You must really hate golf." She shook her head. "Oddly enough, I understand that. There's skill to it, but no real competition. It's the head-to-head, no-contact sports that bug me." Kelaine shrugged. "Takes more skill, no to touch?" "Not," Ann corrected. "Not to touch. And I suppose I'm still surprised that men can make a living playing such sports, and get paid the insane amounts they do." Bethany laughed at that. "Aye, that they do. I've a cousin just got in with the Dolphins. That's an American football team. He's making $1.5 million a year and keeping only $250 for himself and his mother. The rest he sends up here. Of course, any time he needs extra, Uncle Ian's more than happy to make sure he has it." Ann was surprised to hear Ian's voice before she sensed his presence or heard his footsteps. But then she was concentrating very hard on working her lace by feel, and the boys were being awfully loud.
"A fair chunk of that sits in a college fund for those what want it. Investments and all."
"Wise," Ann smiled. "I am somewhat surprised you're not in there with them," she added, nodding her head in the direction of the game.
"Nope, prefer my sports, full contact."
"This does not surprise me." She listened as Ian crossed the room to the window between her and Gabby, chuckling.
"When the football season rolls around, boy, I'll be riding there with him. Now, Friday, heaven help any idiot who causes trouble. That's the Herrero Hingenosa fight, and I don't aim to miss it."
"Preference for pugilism?" Ann cocked an eyebrow. "Again, I'm not surprised." Bethany piped up. "What is it about Guerrero that you like so much?"
"The man's got pluck, that's what." "Well, I'll be damned,"
Ian muttered. "What's the matter?" Gabby asked.
"The Scot, Skye. He's out on the lawn with some of the younger boys showing them swords."
"If it be something you don't want, you need to speak to him on the matter," Ann advised. "To my memory, that's what he did over there. Trained." Ian looked over at her.
"Really? That's interesting and useful to know. Let's go have a chat with the lad."
The girls were off the floor, quick as jackrabbits, and headed for the door to watch. Ann and Gabby rose at more sedate paces, and as Ann moved across the floor, she tripped over a book Kelaine had left behind. She would have gone sprawling had Ian not snaked out his arm and caught her.
"Kelaine!"
he bellowed. The girl popped immediately back in the room, quailed at the dark expression on the chief's face. She understood instantly and ran to sweep up her things. "I'm sorry, Examine. I wasn't thinking." Ann's eyebrow went up and Gabby stifled a giggle.
"Are you trying to say miss?"
Ian growled in English, though Ann could tell he was amused. Kelly looked up, startled. "Aye?" "Trying, Ian, not enough," Ann offered with a tender smile. Kelly looked mortified. "What'd I say? You called me an auditor, I think." "No mind," she insisted, curtailing any further embarrassment on the girl's part. "Now, I know it seems I can see everything now, with the fairy gift, but I can't. I can see the touched, but I can't see you or your things." "What you need is a guide dog," Bethany offered from the doorway. That thought did not please her for some reason. "I don't know." Gabby shook her head. "Might be a problem with us. Some of us, anyway. We'd have to get a dog raised among us for that, and that'd take too long. Maybe a tap stick?" "That might be better. Easier to get used to, at least," Anne sighed. "How do I—" Before she could finish her sentence, Ian was gone from her side and out the door with a flash of feather and wing. "What was that all about?" Kelly muttered, from the sound of things still gathering her homework from the floor. "No telling with him." Gabby sighed and stepped up to Anne, taking her arm and guiding her around the mess. "Come on." They were in the hallway when he returned from the east wing where he kept his private study, with a shillelagh in his hand. Anne stopped, registering the stick immediately. Its edges were sharper than other things around that she could see, except for the tip, which shimmered as if something invisible were there. He crossed to her and held it out. She reached up for it, felt a tingle run through her hand up her arm as she touched it. For a full second, both their hands remained on the weapon. The tingling subsided, and Ian let go. "Thank you," was all she could manage, "but 'tis magical."
"I know,"
he said mildly. "Can't be." Gabby frowned at it. "I can see it."
"Beware the tip,"
he warned. "It's shod in iron, Ian. How can it be magical?" Gabby insisted. He shrugged.
"That's cold iron, by the by."
Anne lifted and turned the stick, sliding her hand down within inches of the cold iron she could feel throbbing at its base. "What's wrong with getting her a normal tapstick?"
"I don't have one."
"Or a mundane shillelagh till we can." He chuckled.
"Girl's got to defend herself. Plus, it won't let her get lost."
With that, he moved out the front door onto the porch. Anne let the others go, though Gabby stood by her a moment more. She stood there, running her hands over the old, knobbed wood. It had been polished smooth by years and hands, not by any tool or varnish. It felt right to her. She let it slide through her loose hand to the gently curving end. It fit in her palm perfectly. She turned towards the door. She knew where it was by the breeze on her face. Sweeping the tip across the floor experimentally, she found nothing in her path, but noticed the edge of the carpet runner without having touched it. She stepped forward with more confidence than she had in weeks, and followed Gabby's footsteps onto the front porch. Bethany was sitting on the porch rail next to where Ian stood, watching skies showing a young man the sword he always had at his back. She gathered the impression that there were more than one young man when bits of the one she could see kept shifting out of view for no reason. Gabby stepped back beside her, out of her way so she could see. The young man's features were dark, like polished wood, and seemed to have a very fine grain to them. His fingers were long and delicate, and when he spoke, there was a faint twang to it, like harp-strings. Gabby noticed her studying the boy and commented, "Can you see what he was?" Anne shook her head. "I'm not sure. I see something. He were no beast like most I've seen, nor altered as the commander was for a soldier. But you know he is one of the taken." "Oh, aye, that I can see him at all tells me that." Gabby nodded. "That's Billy Younger. He was taken and made into a harp." "That explains that." "His brothers are here because they came to us to get him out." She laughed. "It was all very Jack and the Beanstalk. Sans Jack, of course," she added with a sigh. "Him we couldn't rescue." "There's a cloud castle with a giant?" Gabby shrugged. "There are lots of little realms. Most are under siege by one of the big ones most times, unless they're well hidden or really small. We've got people from all over. Liberty came from the Sky King too. We found her when we rescued Billy and a small handful of others. Couldn't get Jack, though." "Jack? The Jack? Jack of the Tales?" "Yep. He's chained to the throne. Next time Johnny's around, ask him to sing you Jack's song." Their attention was diverted by Ian leaping over the rail to the ground and crossing the lawn to the group. Anne could hear other voices than the three she could see, and heard one of them pelting away towards the carriage house when Ian told him to go get something.
"You want to learn swords, boys?"
Ian asked. There was a resounding assent.
"You want to learn it from him?"
"We think so, sir," one of them chirped. Ian turned to Skye.
"Well, Afore I let you teach my folk, I need to assess your skill.
Ian held his hand out behind him as the footsteps came running back. From what An could tell, a sword was placed in his hand.
Now, I'll not want you going easy on me, my being an old man and all.
Gabby and the girls snickered at that.
But we'll go a few rounds of serious fighting.
Ian began. Skye cleared his throat. Begging your pardon, laird, but I've never lost on the field. And if either of us gets hurt serious... Ian's thumb jerked over his shoulder to the porch.
That's what Gabby's over there for. She knows the fairy healing, same as my daughter.
Skye shrugged and settled into his stance. Very well then, sir. On your own head be it. Ian laughed, muttering something about young pups or rips and set to with a will. An watched for a few minutes before getting bored with it. She could see the combatants, but only one of the weapons, and it made the whole thing look rather silly to her. She could not appreciate the finer points of the matter. Besides, there was something in her hands that wanted her attention more. She found her way to one of the numerous rocking chairs and sat, running her hands lovingly across the satiny wood. The clanging of metal and grunting of men faded into the background. There was only her and the shillelagh. She knew things about it, more the longer she stroked it, felt out every nick and gouge and imperfection in the wood. For one, she would never get lost with it. All she had to do was tap the ground with it in front of her home, and it had to be earth, not stone or wood, and it would always guide her back to that spot if she but asked, or to any location so set. It was also more than happy to be used as a weapon, and would make her an excellent one, it promised, would come to her when called, resist the hands of others. All she had to do was name it. And the iron tip, she thought to it. Name me, and put it. She thought only briefly, and smiled, loving the irony. Kippeen. Without thinking on the matter, her hand reached for the iron tip, and she gasped as the stick slid down to prevent her touching it. She tried again. The same thing happened. The stick moved of its own accord to prevent her from hurting herself. She knew instinctively that the iron tip would never land on anything she did not intend it to, that would take special damage from iron. She stood, drifted to the steps, and, with the shillelagh guiding her feet, descended to the front walk and turned aside to the lawn. She raised it a hand or two above the ground, then rapped it sharply on the grassy earth thrice. She felt the power surge through her fingers, sent a shiver down her spine. She smiled, knew without a doubt, no matter where she was, that if she had Kippeen with her, she would always return here. She suddenly became aware that the fighting had stopped and the combatants, at least, were looking at her. Forgive me, am I in the way?
Hey, lass.
Ian chuckled.
So, what'd you name her?
Kippeen. Skye scowled even as Ian grinned. He wiped sweat from his forehead. You named it for a drumstick? She gave a soft laugh. Aye, for drumming saints into thick heads. The younger boys, and apparently a few others who had drifted up, laughed at that. Skye ignored them. You need summat to find your way. One of those white ones with the red ends. This'll find me way fine, thank you, kind, she countered delicately. But that's a shillelagh. Folks see that and take it for a weapon, they're liable to test you. What'll you do on some punk loon decide to mug you? Her smile crept shyly up one side of her mouth. Drum some saints into his thick head. There was a moment's silence, then the lot of them fell out laughing, some at the very notion, others at the way she said it. She did not mind either. She pitched her voice so she could be heard. I'll admit I've some drawbacks to work around, and I'd never stand up to a swordsman such as yourself for the chafe, but I'm no shy hand. I supervised children. I'm very good at taking things away. The laughter died down. I'd be obliged to you. You showed me a thing or two to compensate, she added. Skye sighed as Ian threw up his hands and stepped back. Fine. I'll see what you can first, though. He took up his stance with a weapon she could not see. Apparently, during the fighting, they had switched to practice swords made of wood. I'll go easy on you. She turned a little sideways, watching the way he held himself, trying to judge the length and placement of the weapon. Don't do me no favours, she taunted. I'll not thank you to baby me. Fine, lass. Have it your own. He growled and lunged. The blow would have landed on her shoulder, but she swung the stick up and in the way. Kippeen had obviously helped a little, giving her just the hair of an edge. The force of the blow was not his full strength, she could tell, though she could not gauge what those limits were. She didn't really want to find out yet. She needed to get that weapon out of play. She took a step back and waited again, watching every twitch of his enormous body. She saw the incoming swing and ducked under and into it, cracking him at the base of the wrist at the thumb, forcing him to drop the sword. She took advantage of his surprise and rapped him smartly on the ribs, though not hard enough to do any real damage. Without warning, one of the younger boys came up behind her and grabbed her. As he pressed against her, the head of the shillelagh came up and rapped him in the forehead, and as his hands belatedly flew to protect himself, the iron-shod end was dropped sharply onto the top of his foot. He hopped away from her, yelping, over to where Gabby waited to patch him up. This time she saw Ian signal to another bystander to try and attack her. Skye laughed when Billy shook his head vigorously, throwing up his hands. On's stick flew out with lightning speed to crack Skye sharply across the calf. He jumped as if he'd been switched, yelped as he danced back.
"What's that in, ye vicious kine? There's iron there."
"Aye," she snapped. "And it'll nary touch you an you behave yourself. Now get serious. I need to know these things." He sighed, straightened up. Leaving his weapon on the ground, he went at her. She struck out with the shillelagh, made only glancing contact that was brushed aside as he tackled her, lifting her bodily from the ground and throwing her back to it. She landed hard, the wind knocked out of her and the shillelagh from her grasp. She rolled to her hands and knees, held out one hand, and Capine flew directly into it. She used her to stand. She bowed to Skye. "Thank ye. Now, show me how not to let that happen again." He stood straighter, looming taller somehow, assessing her. Finally he nodded.
"First, though, I want you to hit me again with that stick. Not the back end!"
he yelped, dodging prematurely as she held it just below the knob. She deftly flipped it, letting it slide just past the halfway mark.
"As hard as you can. I want to ken your strength."
She obliged, watched his eyes bulge for a second, though he did not move or yield to the blow she landed on his thigh. There was amusement in Ian's voice. "So how hard can she hit?" Skye's voice was strained, trying to control the pain.
"If I weren't what I am, it'd be broken, sir."
He hobbled back, held up a hand.
"Give me a mo."
There was another round of laughter at that, himself included. It was getting towards dark when Martha stood on the porch steps and called out over the sound of laughing and good-hearted melee.
"Oi, you lot!"
They paused exactly as they were, Skye bent over in a headlock with Reggie. They all looked in her direction, even Ian, who was supervising a round robin at on with some of the mortal lads.
"I'm putting dinner on the table in exactly 30 minutes. Any of you lot not bathed and dressed proper and at the table at that time will be fed out in the kennels with the other dogs. Bethany, pet, go set my table for however many louts has happened to be out there what you think might make it."
With that, she turned and went back into the house, wiping her hands on her apron more out of habit than any real need. Everyone remained frozen for half a second, then made a mad scramble for the house. Skye tucked himself deeper into the headlock closer to Reggie's belly, then lifted, neatly tossing Reggie off him and onto his back with a loud thump. He turned to help him up, both men laughing. Reggie grimaced, closing his eyes and turning his head away, making a face.
"Regimental? Really?"
Skye laughed.
"You're just figuring that out."
Anne allowed Ian to take her arm to escort her back into the house. He pointed at a cluster of boys who were apparently dirtier than the rest.
"Oi, you lot can share in the carriage house. Shan't have my hide, I'll let you track that in the house."
He warned her about the steps, went up them at a pace she could match.
"I really need to build more bathrooms,"
he chuckled. Dinner was like any large family affair. Noisy. Without remembering details, Anne found herself in familiar territory, even down to competing for the last rolls. At a glare from Ian, whoever's hand was in the basket next to hers rolled the last bun into her grasp and withdrew. Anne thanked them and was rewarded with a mumble. Conversations were mixed and many. Anne was engaged in a light conversation with Gabby and Bethany about gardening. The boys were going on about the basketball game. At the far end, Ian and Skye were discussing serious matters of skill with Reggie. "I think the boys could use the training, and they certainly want it. It'll keep them out of trouble this summer," Reggie was saying. "Besides, think of the look on the Russians' faces when our boys start wielding lead pipes like claymores," he laughed.
"I agree there are advantages,"
Ian conceded.
"And if they have to fight off one of them, they'll have an edge."
Skye shrugged.
"Aye, I taught such things over there. Swords, drills, close combat. I like the work. We'll need a place, though. A field, a hall. I prefer a field for some of it, a gym for others. Not always going to fight outdoors. Need to learn to work around."
Ian nodded.
Also, though I doubt there'll be a whole lot of call, you might want to teach them battle calls. Signals for things like fall back, lift flank, charge, retreat.
The last Skye said with distaste.
Might surprise you how much call there'll be,
Ian said softly.
if you ever get into an open fight with those bloody Russians. I'd like to be able to call a fade out when the police are incoming. Leave the bastards to face the music alone.
Reggie frowned, weighing the pros and cons, though there was a gleam of hope for it in his eye. You really think it'll come to that?
Might like,
Ian said shortly.
So you accepting the job, Skye?
He asked, turning back to the man.
Knowing you're teaching mob boys to better do their dirty work.
Skye didn't really hesitate.
Aye, Laird, you've given me a roof and a bellyful.
He lowered his voice.
You've taken in what I'm charged with. I can't bloody well wander off elsewhere, and I might as well make myself useful. The illegalities don't bother me much, though I'm not going to do any hits for you unless they're gunning for me own, but other than...
What's a little rum running between friends? He grinned.
Asides, where else in this day and age am I going to find a job teaching lads to break heads? Or to use a sword? Who else has a wooden claymore just lying around?
They laughed. Gabby had patched them up, but Skye could still feel the bruising he had taken from his battle with Ian. As Reggie and the chief discussed details and he refilled his plate, Skye mulled over the fight. They had begun lightly enough, assessing one another. Eventually they had realized the other was holding back and had laid it on thicker. This escalation had continued until they realized they were close to really trying to kill each other, and were very closely matched, sword to sword. Ian had told him that if it had not been for what Ian was, Skye might have been able to take him. He knew without being told, though, had the fight gone to brawling or wrestling, that he was hopelessly outmatched. He had a mouthful of potatoes when he realized he had been addressed directly.
Sir?
He mumbled, trying to be polite and not open his full mouth more than he had to.
I said, welcome to the family. Your role will be minor, but significant.
Skye swallowed quickly, shook the extended hand.
Thank you.
I'll introduce you to Danny later. He's our builder. Let you work the specs on your needs. I've a cul-de-sac I'm finishing up just on the other side of the wood from the Rath. Not a bad place to put it. You'll have a house right near on you like. My daughter's in that cul-de-sac and it's just finished. Which reminds me.
He raised his voice to be heard across the table.
Any of you lot be wanting another free supper and maybe a round or two at the pub, best be showing up on Liberty's doorstep Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. to help her move.
There were several assents and a few groans from those that would be unavailable. Skye basked in the warmth of it all. A place, not just as a soldier, something essential to do without resorting to menial tasks. The idea of bussing tables had not appealed to him, though he had not been able to see himself getting any other kind of work. Maybe construction if he was lucky, but he hadn't the references, or really the skills beyond the muscle. Now he would be able to do what he loved. And he was getting a home out of it, something completely unexpected. His eyes went around the table, paused at the governess. On. His responsibility. He turned back to Ian.
After dinner, if I could beg a private word.
Ian nodded readily.
We'll go to my study after pie.
Pie?
He echoed, perking up.
What kind of pie?
Ian took a deep breath.
Maple apple pear crumble, I'm thinking.
Skye caught the same scent Ian had and quickly cleaned his plate. Ian's study was a comfortable affair. Thick, dark wood paneling, shelves of books, an antique mahogany desk that looked like it had been there since the house was built. There was a fireplace on one wall, above which was a painting of a fey-looking woman in a medieval gown smiling mischievously, with several Irish wolfhounds lounging around her. The hardwood floors were covered by a thick, elaborately patterned rug from India, and from somewhere cold air was piped in. It was an interior room with no windows, so ventilation of some sort was needed. So far, this was the only room he'd encountered that had air conditioning. Ian sank into a large, padded office chair behind the desk, propping his stockinged feet up on its edge. Skye took the couch, sitting with his elbows on his thighs and his clasped hands dangling between his knees. Ian patiently lit a cigarette, offered him one, which he accepted. It gave him something to do with his hands while he thought. Ian waited him out.
You've not asked me a terrible lot of questions, he began. But then, I've not got the memory loss the governess has. I didn't get the case of forgetfulness, she did.
Case of forgetfulness?
Skye nodded. Aye, I've seen it, been told. Sometimes it's easier when they leave to not remember that place. I couldn't afford it. I had to remember. Protect her from the wolves, he said. That's my duty, and I'll do it to my lass, but I cannot do it from a distance, you ken? Ian watched him a long moment, taking a deep drag on his cigarette.
So, you're concerned with her living up here at the house and you living all the way out yon and not trusting my security?
Skye was quick to refute that.
No, not at all. I'm...
He racked his brain, sighed.
It's not a security issue. You're not always around. She's blind. There's a million little dangers about.
The iron in the kitchen for X.
And all that twig you gave her, he groaned.
You know you can't shatter her every moment of her life, right?
Skye leaned back on the couch.
Aye, she'd hate me for it too, and I did.
Rightly.
But what's a man to do?
Let her live her life. Aye, keep an eye out for the big stuff, but out here, there's not a lot of the big stuff. There's plenty in this house that keeps that kind of eye on. Your problem will be when she decides she wants to go out there, beyond the wall. And she will. Likely soon,
he observed.
I've noticed she's been a mite restless of late. You may keep her occupied a while with the self-defence.
But that'll backfire in the end, won't it? She'll believe she's right and fine, and the wolves will have governess for tea.
Ian studied him carefully.
Any particular wolves you've got an eye out for?
Skye took a draw on his forgotten cigarette, shook his head.
Nah, he just said there were wolves out here and he'd have her safe. I assumed he meant those would prey on the blind and helpless.
Ian gave an amused snort.
Like as you noticed this afternoon, she's not as helpless as you thought, boy.
Skye chuckled at that.
Well, I do feel for any unnatural what tries his hand. 'Tis the ones you canna see that worry me.
They smoked in silence for a bit.
Does she know you're the one saved her life?
Skye's head snapped up at that.
How'd you ken that?
As far as he knew, no one on this side knew but him. An eyebrow went up.
I'll take that for a no. I've my ways, lad. The hedge is up only when we expect unwanted visitors, like Beltane or Samhain. Keeps the bitch from riding through and taking what pleases her. Other than that, we know how to open it. We can come and go as it pleases. Those that desire to risk it.
You sent a letter,
he said flatly. He remembered the occasional missive coming up that road from the watchman, having to choose a man he thought ready to deliver it to the castle. He should have known. Not all the letters were of Fae origin.
Do you care for her?
Beyond your duty. Skye looked down at that, thought long and hard.
You don't have to tell me,
Ian said, crushing out his cigarette.
Just so as you know yourself why you're doing what you are.
She were good with the bairns,
he finally answered.
I've seen her once or twice, from a distance, and in the pavilion saying her goodbyes. I saw how deeply it hurt her to leave him behind, but she never let it be shown on her face. I think I'm the only one saw that tear.
Ian let him ruminate a few. His fingertips found something stuck to the edge of his desk by the blotter, and he concentrated on scraping it up with a fingernail.
Are you still loyal to the king?
He asked casually. Skye stared at him, watched him meticulously peel up whatever was stuck to the wood, trying to assess why he was asking and how he might react to the truth. He found he didn't really care.
As far as I'm concerned, I haven't left his service, he said flatly. My thought changes whether you still wish me to teach your lads. I'm sorry for all that. I'll take the girl and go.
Still not looking directly at him.
What makes you think it would?
Skye was beginning to get irritated. His hand itched and the sword seemed more obvious on his back. The fact that he should be leaning on it and wasn't never occurred to him. It was never really all here unless it was in his hand anyway. He got himself under control.
I've talked with the locals, some of the taken. Fox, for instance. Some of the lads are downright hostile about the gentry what kept him. Seem to think they be all the same cloth, you ken. I know better. But I'll respect your right to your opinion.
Ian laughed.
You're fine, laddie buck. Stand down. I feel the same. I've done my time and made my trade, but I begrudge them nothing. Some, on the other hand, they're right wankers, you ken. I just needed to know your stance. If you're still loyal to him, we'll be having no conflict. Though I need you to understand, you answer to me now. The old way. You've called me laird until now, and I've let it slip. But it means it now. We do this. I'm your liege, Ian, as he is your king.
Skye did not waste time thinking about it.
Aye, I'll do it. So long as you can. She goes another way, I'm honour bound to follow.
He rose, moved to bend to his knee, but Ian held up his hand.
No need, your word be enough. Time was I'd have gone through the full formalities, but those days are long gone. You swear in the king's name to accord me all the rights and duties as your liege lord?
I so swear in the name of the Griffin King to obey ye, Laird Ian O'Keefe, the Oak King, as my liege laird until such time as you release me from my service.
Ian smiled at the added titles.
You swear, boy, you put some weight into it.
He laughed and poured the two of them a whiskey.